Hello, everybody. This is a new feature on SpaceQ, an unnamed feature at this point. It's just an interview with guests on different topics that are pertinent to Canadians and to our global audience. Today, my very special guest is David Kendall. He is the former chair, United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and the former Director General of the Canadian Director General of Space Science and Technology at the Canadian Space Agency. That's a mouthful. Let's just say he's an expert in this area. Hello, David. You're in Victoria. I'm in London. How's life in Victoria treating you these days? Nice weather?
Lovely weather. Yes, we're having actually a good week. Very warm. The beaches are nice. I can't complain. In fact, we've had, I know it's topical, but we've had no cases of the virus on the island now for about a week. So we're feeling good, but we have to be very cautious.
That's excellent to know. London is a little bit behind you. We have a few more cases that have popped up this weekend, but we're doing pretty good overall.
Right.
So the reason why I have you on the show today is because in the last couple months, the US is moving forward with some more of its space policy directives, executive orders, and a lot of this revolves around the Artemis program and space resources, primarily in cislunar space, but elsewhere as well. So let's just start off with, in April, we got an executive order from the White House on encouraging international support for the recovery and use of space resources. And I'll just read just a little bit of it for the audience. The order reads in part, Americans should have the right to engage in commercial exploration, recovery, and use of resources in outer space, consistent with applicable law. Now, outer space is a legally and physically unique domain of human activity, and the United States does not view it as a global commons. That's a key point there. Accordingly, it shall be the policy of the United States to encourage international support for the public and private recovery and use of resources in outer space consistent with the applicable law. So unpack that for me. What does that mean from a space policy global perspective in Canada?
It basically states what the US has stated on several occasions, not in an executive order from the White House, but various members of NASA, the National Advisory Council, of course, the executive director of that, Scott Pace, has mentioned many of these things in the past. So one shouldn't be surprised at the language to some extent. What is a little surprising, I think, maybe, or a little different is, of course, now this is coming from the White House. And as far as I understand, and I'm not an expert on executive orders, but it has effectively the force of law in the United States. The president, through an executive order, has now said this is going to be the official position, not coming from a spokesperson, but coming from the highest level. So now we have a very clear indication of where the US are coming from. So let's unpack it a little bit. The fact that the executive order says that private individuals can own and recover and own artifacts or material from outer space is, of course, not new. This came from the 2015 Commercial Space Launch Competitive Act that was under the previous administration of President Obama. So this is not new. The fact that they are now claiming that, well, not claiming, but stating that the US do not believe outer space to be a global commons is, I think, going to be an area that is going to make people sit up and say, let's think about this a little bit, because where is the US coming from? And for those viewers that would like to look further into this, there's an excellent article by PJ Blount and another anonymous author under Space Watch Global that argues quite interestingly that the US military have been using the term global commons for space for some time. in order to say, look, we're going to have to develop our defensive or we're going to have to watch this fairly carefully. There are many there are statements by senior military people in the US quite recently in the past few years that have expressed space as a global commons. And now we've got a different interpretation of what global commons is. And really although global commons, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I believe that the term global commons has never really been defined in a comprehensive way. I think most people realize that global commons is an area, let's put it that way, where it does not belong to anybody. And everybody, of course, there are three common interpretations of global commons. One is the high seas, one is the Antarctic, and the other has always been outer space. So for now, the US to say, we do not believe that space is a global commons, it sort of says, well, what do you believe space to be then? That it can be appropriated by whoever wants to appropriate it, which they cannot do since they are signatories to the Outer Space Treaty, which clearly says under Article 2 that they cannot appropriate it. So this is really an area where I think a lot of people are sort of saying, scratching their heads and saying, well, if you don't think that space is a global commons, what do you think it is? And why have you come out with this statement to say that this is something else? Because it's really and one of the issues I think here, Mark, is that this is going to since the US wants to have agreements with a lot of people. Of course, with the executive order, they asked the State Department to have to come up with bilateral or multilateral agreements with partners in 180 days. I think many partners are going to say, okay, this is one of the areas there now we're going to have to think about. I don't think the whole issue of ownership, let's say, of space resources is now an issue of great concern to a lot of countries. We already have multiple tons of moon rock sitting in a repository in Houston somewhere, and if we're going to go out and really explore and send humanity out into outer space, there's nobody that doesn't think that we're going to have to use the resources. So I think that question now, although there was a lot of I would say legal concern about it a few years ago, I think that question has now been settled, or more and more has been settled. But so that part of the executive order is non-controversial. But the global commons, it seems it seems to be like a bit of a bull, like a red flag to a bull. Why have they now want to state that, and what purpose does it have? And that's really a very interesting question.
It's interesting because one of the parties who's actually been advocating for this and was actually very prominent in getting some of these ideas put forward was Bob Richards,
yes,
of Moon Express, a Canadian.
Yes.
The other thing that I'd like to point out is that an executive order, from what I understand, can be rescinded by the current president or by another president, future president. Which brings into the question this. The US under President Obama and now President Trump has been pushing forward in this arena of space resource utilization, going beyond low Earth orbit. And it looks like that push is actually moving forward now. I mean, we've had starts and stops over many decades, but this looks like it might have a little bit of momentum. But there's an election in November. We're in the middle of a pandemic. What happens come November and let's say Donald Trump is not re-elected president? Does that mean that a new president's going to come in and say, well, you know what, maybe we're being a little too forceful on this, and once again we're going to have this a change in policy?
Yeah, I think you asked a very key question here, Mark. Yeah, what is going to happen in the future? And again, this leads to what could, would, should or would Canada's position be, or any other partner that is now going to be asked to sign on to the executive order and to the Accords, Artemis Accords. If you look at history, and of course we all have, at what happens with a change of administration in the United States, space policy or space direction of the space program almost always changes, and always has changed over the past several presidents. We know Mr. Bush's push towards the moon, another one towards Mars, or Mr. Obama's push towards asteroids, now Mr. Trump's push back to the moon again and onto Mars. If you're quite, I think you're quite right. Come November, if if Mr. Trump does not gain re-election, and Mr. Biden comes in, who is, from my reading, very much more of a multinationalist than a nationalist, should we see, or could we see, a change of the policy? And I think this is very much an open question. So it goes then to the heart of the question: what should Canada be doing when this executive order is put in front of them and said, "Would you please sign on, because we want to, we'd like you to join us in agreeing to these issues, or these statements." And you know, almost to sum up this this interview, I would say that the Canadian government, or any other government for that matter, should be fairly careful about signing on to something which is still in flux, and could very well change in the next six or so months. Yeah.
Now, of course, after the executive order was put forward, we now have the Artemis Accords.
Yes.
Which are the principles for a safe, peaceful, and prosperous future. Wonderful language. Mm-hmm. And there are 10 principles. And I think for the most part, people would read these principles and just say, well, this is great. You know, peaceful purposes, transparency in what you're doing, interoperability, emergency assistance, you know, registration of space objects, although that one, we can talk about that one. Release of scientific data, protecting heritage, space resources. There's another one that that needs a little bit of talking about. Now, deconfliction of activities. That one's going to be a big one with its safety zones and orbital debris and spacecraft disposal. So before we actually get into the principles themselves, you may not have the answer to this, but maybe you have a little bit of insights based on your history at the Canadian Space Agency. You know, the US came to Canada and said, we've got this, you know, it's had many names now rolled up into the Artemis program, but the Lunar Gateway, which is the orbital space station around the moon, Canada signed on to this program last year, committed a significant amount of money, $1.9 billion specifically for this program over 24 years. And we agreed, we're going to go forward with this. Now the Artemis principles, or Artemis Accords, come out and they say, by the way, we're going to have to sign up for a bilateral agreement on this, and you're going to have to agree to these principles. And so even if you agree to these principles, don't you have to flesh out what some of them means? Because there's definitely some language in here that could be a problem for Canada. Do you think?
Absolutely. And the question is, again, going back to the previous discussion, what is the gateway now? I don't know. It's still being talked about as a cislunar space station in some form. But the question is that will the next will the next administration, whoever it might be, and even if it's Mr. Trump's administration, will they continue with the gateway? We're in a very, very interesting situation here. Of course, every country now is going into a massive deficit. There's and will the US continue to pour money into their space program in order to get the first woman and the next US man onto the moon? Of course, they continue to say it will be by 2024. I have not read any good argument that would say that they can possibly do that, given all the slips that they have and the issues they have. And now they're faced, and Canada's faced, and Europe's faced, and Japan is faced, and Russia's faced with massive deficits that they've had to put in place in order to mitigate as much as they can the issues that we're dealing with the pandemic. Things are going to change. Is the gateway? I will ask you the question: is the gateway going to continue to survive? Probably it will. Will the timeline slip? I think it has to inevitably slip. And when the question one might ask, and has to be asked is, so what have we signed up for? Now, I think that there's a two-pronged point about this, Mark, as you well know. The government, when it signed up to the gateway, it basically signed up, I believe, because at that point in time, the government had to make a decision as to whether or not there was going to be a future for the Canadian space program. The space program was in significant had significant problems, basically because we did not know where the government was heading and whether or not it was seeing Canada as continuing to be a major player in international space activities. They made a commitment, and the commitment was, I think, timely, and I think the right one, in that Canada will be a player in the future in international, multinational space endeavors dealing with exploration. And at that time, it was called the Gateway. In the future, it may be some other form that Canada will decide, working with the partners, to find out what their new contribution is going to be to the new program, because the program will have to be changed now, and Canada and other countries, as I say, are going to have to look very carefully at the implications of the situation that we're in, because the new normal will include space.
Now, this might not be a fair question,
okay,
but if you're a European member state, if you're Canada, do you just buy your time until the election and see what happens?
Yeah, I think so. My view is that you have to. I mean, what are you going to sign on to here? What exactly are you signing on to? It could be there are many levels to these various, both the executive order that they're trying to develop a bilateral series of agreements. They don't call them agreements. And also with respect to the Artemis Accords. My view is that Canada should work, in fact, closely with its allies, and these allies being the traditional allies that we worked with for many, many years. We know these people very well. We work very closely with them. I'm talking about European Space Agency and the Japanese, and Canada should start talking to these people intensely at a very high level as to, so what do we do as the main key partner agencies when the US come to us individually, as what they're asking to do, not as a group. They're saying they're going to come individually, and because I think that the three partners have a tremendous amount of power, not power exactly, maybe the wrong word, influence here on how to move forward. And I think that there is a strength in numbers to some extent with Canada working closely and making sure that any agreements that are signed with the US are signed in a cooperative way with our other two major partners in the International Space Station Agreement. I think Canada has a perfectly good and strong position to make here, and let's see where that takes us.
Now, with the Artemis Accords themselves, the 10 principles,
yep.
What stands out to you as being problematic to start with?
Two things really are very problematic in my opinion. First of all, how do you put an accord together, international accord on best practices and common principles? And let me say that I very much agree with the ideas behind this accord. I think that with my long association with Copious, the US are clearly frustrated at dealing now with a very slow body in order to get a multilateral agreement. Now Copious is 95 member states. It works by, as we know, by consensus. Therefore, to get consensus on 95 different countries is a real struggle. And US, I think, are saying, in my opinion, well, to hell with it. Let's see what we can do outside of that forum. And I have no issue with that. I think that if US are going to move forward with their program as aggressively as they say they want to, even though I don't think they can, they need to have some certainty especially with the commercial sector. And this is a way to, I would say, push the internationals into saying, okay, we're going to go with or without you, and here's some principles. Now, what I'll go back to so effectively, I think that this is a good document in that it can start a very intense negotiation process, and I hope it will. But where are the issues? Number one, there are only 2 states or countries right now that have the wherewithal to get a human onto the surface of the moon in the next decade or so, and that is the US and China. Without the Chinese, who have fairly big ambitions, and they will, in my opinion, follow through with them, this accord does not make a lot of sense. If you're going to have agreements on best practices and common sets of principles on exploring the moon, you've got to have China along and saying, yes, we are going to work with these various sectors, the peaceful purposes, the transparency, the interoperability, the registration, the emergency assistance. Yes, we are going to have to agree with China. The second thing that I would say is that we have some of these guidelines on how to operate in space already negotiated in a multilateral forum, and that is through the so-called long-term sustainability guidelines that were signed off by the 95 states last year of Copious. And let me say the US were extremely helpful and forward-looking in working with the other countries. They were a great partner in getting those 21 guidelines signed off. It's surprising to me that the Artemis Accords does not even mention the 21 long-term sustainability guidelines, because they deal with some of this transparency, some of this space debris, some of these other safety aspects, but they don't mention it. And that to me is a little surprising, but we'll find out. The last, and this is a political statement, the last issue that I have with it is that, to be blunt, there isn't an international agreement that Mr. Trump doesn't like to tear up, and this will cause a tremendous amount, I think, angst amongst the partners as we move forward. What certainty, what assurances do we have that this agreement, as we move forward, let's say Mr. Trump is re-elected, and we move into the next stage, Mr. Trump says, well, that was then, now we're going to do this. And the record is not good. The record is in fact awful. And so there's a lack of trust, I think, that has now been built up. And that's going to cause, I think, incredible difficulty with many states now wanting to, in fact, even sign on something. So those are the big issues that I see with this accord. What will it? How much can you rely on this accord, even if you signed onto it?
I have one last question. And this has to do with the International Space Exploration Coordination Group. That group has been, for years, working towards a multilateral agreement, if you will, or guidelines of what we should be doing in space, where we should be going next, how we should be doing it, how we should be cooperating. Is that thrown out the window now because the Artemis Accords have come along and the US is saying, this is the way we're going to do it, and you're either with us or you're not?
I don't think so, Mark. I think that the International Coordination Group did a great service in bringing us to where we are. They have been working for a decade, more than a decade. I used to be a member of that group when I was at the Canadian Space Agency, and used to attend their meetings and represent Canada. And they've steadily been saying, look, this is coming, let's put some architecture, let's put some ideas forward, let's see how we can cooperate. And remember, that group also includes, I think it still includes, it used to certainly include China as part of the coordination group. So we have everybody there. We have the 15, I think about 15 space agencies that were always brainstorming and working towards new ideas. And I think so. I would say the International Coordination Group did its job. It got us to where we are right now, and saying that now the states at a higher level, the administrators of the various agencies now have to take this and move it forward. What I would say, though, is that there are some very active activities that can guide the international partners, and I speak of three of them. One, of course, is the Hague International Space Resources Governance Working Group that has recently put out its building blocks, which do not proscribe what an international accord should be, but have listed all of the various things that people should think about as you develop an international framework, which they call it international framework for future cooperation. They've recently announced these, and there's a book even come out, 150-page book that describes all of the arguments and discussions behind these. This is a fabulous compendium of what states should think about as they start to put in these frameworks. The second is the Moon Village Association, which has come out with a set of principles, again, as how to set up an international lunar cooperative program. And of course, we have our own Outer Space Institute, which came out with a set of the Vancouver recommendations, which look at certain aspects of how to develop an international framework, international accord. And I think so that there's a lot of stuff now that's come out from independent experts. These are not government people, but these are industry people. These are academics and etc. and others. And I think that those three documents are now a very good blueprint as to how people can work together, inside or outside the Accords. It depends on how flexible US are going to be. I think right at the beginning of our discussion, you mentioned, of course, what is is the US going to say, these are the Accords, here's the pen, sign it? Or are they going to say, okay, here are the accords. Now let's get into some discussions. Let's open this up. Let's see where you come from. Let's see how we can move all this forward. What changes do we need to make? That is going to be a very key question, and I don't know the answer to that right at this stage in time.
Well, we can at least say that a good discussion is forthcoming.
Absolutely.
And we're going to, it shines a light on positive steps forward in the use of outer space. So I think that's a good thing in that part. I think I'll leave it at that, David. Thank you for being a guest today, and we'll get you back on the show when we've got more news.
Okay, my pleasure, and thanks very much for inviting me, Mark.